We're really excited to have you. Today we're going to talk over the 3.14 release and talk about what went live and what we're excited about bringing to all of our users. And I have on the line with me a couple of our engineers. I've got Torsten Ball, and I believe Stephen may be joining us at some point. Yeah, so just to kind of go over the agenda, we're going to talk through the release blog post and set some expectations. I would love for you to raise your hand if you have any questions along the way. We're happy to answer questions for you. We'd love to make this more of a conversation. We want to hear from you. We want to talk with you. We don't just want to present at you. So make sure you raise your hand or feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll get to those as well. And we'll have more time for discussion and questions after we go through the whole post. So let me start and share my screen. Can everyone hopefully see the release blog post here?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So Sourcegraph 3.14 got released on March 20th, so last Friday, and it included a bunch of really exciting things. So the first feature that I'm going to talk about is the faster syncing of permissions. So this has gotten really important for us as we've grown our customers. We have customers with much more complex permission hierarchies, and what we're doing here is now actually enabling permissions to be synced in the background. And so this has been an evolution of implementation where we started by making Sourcegraph store this information. And so rather than the issue we were having, I guess, and the reason that this was important is we were fetching the permissions for each user during these requests. And so it was actually slowing down the ability to see search results, the ability to see things quickly, and so it was really degrading the experience for customers that had lots of repositories. Permission syncing is really something that will really help customers with larger instances and that have a need for restricting who can access what information. The next item on the list is forks and archived repositories are excluded by default. So what this means is that rather than showing search results for repositories that have been archived or repositories that are forks, we show results for active repositories. And previously, we would show all of the results, assuming that everyone wanted to see everything. But what we realized is that we really want to make sure that search is fast and that we're showing you the things that are most relevant to you. And so we have made it so that by default, you only see the active things, and you can still continue to search for archived and forks using our search filters. The next item on the list is an improved sign-in flow. So previously, when you were browsing your code, either looking at a pull request or inside of a repository on your code host, such as Bitbucket in this example here, if you weren't signed into Sourcegraph, you would have had to go through a fairly complex back and forth sign-in process. And so what you can see here now is that you're able to just sign in, and then without even needing to refresh your page, you are bounced back into your code host and you're logged in and authenticated and able to get amazing things like our find references and go to definition through our hover code intelligence. Stephen, did you want to talk a little bit about Docker Compose?
Yes.
There you are.
I had to unmute myself. Yeah, so with Docker Compose, what we had seen before was we had really two deployment models. One of them was, a single Docker container that you pull down and you run on your machine. That served us really well for people who land on sourcegraph.com, just want to try out Sourcegraph, maybe run it on their local laptop and share it with a couple people or something like that. And essentially what that does is behind the scenes, it'll run all the same Sourcegraph services that you would run in like a cluster setting. The only difference is it runs them all in a single container with all the resources shared. So all the memory and CPU and file IO and network IO is all shared. And then we had our Kubernetes cluster deployment model where we would essentially give you, all of the Kubernetes YAML that you need to deploy that to a Kubernetes cluster that you provide. And that's like our very scalable solution. What we saw was like, there were a fair number of people who didn't necessarily want the complexity of managing a full Kubernetes cluster, but also want something that scales a little bit better than just the single Docker container image. So we introduced a Docker Compose deployment. This one's pretty nice because essentially, as long as you can throw enough actual hardware at it, it can scale to really whatever. So you could use this for a small team with a couple of people. You could use this for a pretty large team. We've seen this used with a couple tens of thousands of repositories and I think about 2,000 users. So as long as you can give it some hardware, then it can scale up to it pretty easily. And yeah, since it's Docker Compose, it's running in a couple different containers, and so each of those containers has individual resource isolation for it. So that's what gives it the better scaling properties there and stuff. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thanks, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
Torsten, do you want to talk a little bit about some campaigns?
Yeah, sure. Should I provide a nice commentary over the video?
Yeah, that works for me.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of stuff and maybe we can start off with the video. So let's see if this works. We're using all of the bandwidth the internet has to offer now. Streaming videos to your computer, sending it over the internet and we talking about it.
Yeah.
So what we can see here is me running a so-called source action over a bunch of repositories. And
actually, Torsten, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Can you explain what a campaign is?
Oh yeah, sure. So a campaign is a large-scale code change. That means multiple pull requests over tens or hundreds of repositories, if that is easy to grasp, I think. And you can manage all of those in a single UI, which GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket Server or other code hosts don't offer yet, especially not across code hosts, which we do have. And since a campaign is a collection of pull requests across a lot of different repositories, we provide a way to create these pull requests, which is what this is about, what we're seeing here. I'm running a so-called action, which is basically a combination of two things. The first one is which repositories should we create patches for or pull requests for? And the second one is how do we create these pull requests? So what is the diff in these pull requests? So an action definition has a search query, which is a normal Sourcegraph search query. So you can find all of the repositories that match a certain search query. And then in each repository, you can do basically execute whatever you want to produce a diff. And this diff is then turned into a pull request on the code host associated with the repository. And as I said, this can be, run over tens or hundreds of repositories. I think in this example, we're running Go imports, which is a Go tool to, no, it's Go format, I think, right? Go format, which formats Go code across, I don't know, I think 25 repositories in our dog food instance. I filtered those out that have a Go mod file. And then, as you can see here, for some of the repositories, it says no patch produced because they were already up to date on the Go format standard. So if you run Go format, nothing changed. But for some of them, as we can see here, the Terraform provider, for example, a patch was produced because there were, changes that Go format produced in the repository. And then, yeah, so exactly. So if you run it, I now take these patches, a so-called patch set, and turn it into a campaign. That means creating pull requests on code host. So this is the new overhauled, nice looking or better looking UI that was basically completely redesigned, not completely, but overhauled in 3.14. And you give a campaign a title, you give it a description, and then you can see at the bottom.
Used?
Oh yeah, the description and the title are used for the pull requests on the code hosts. You'll see this in a second. So at the bottom here, there's a bunch of patches, which is the same list as we just saw in the terminal with the green output where it says patch produced. So we can see here that, for example, for our LSP adapter repository, it reformatted the code by, indenting white space correctly. So yeah, doing the important stuff. Then, yeah, I hit publish on a single patch, which means the patch gets turned into a pull request on the code host. And that's happening in the background. Then I think I'm about to hit, I hit another button. So now we have 2 pull requests. And this one was created. So if I now open this on GitHub, you can see that the title of the pull request and the body is exactly what I put in for the campaign title and description. And the commit is exactly the diff that we produced in the command line. Yeah. That's a basic walkthrough. And as for the changes in 3.14, the UI has undergone major changes. The filtering here is a big one, that you can filter change sets by state and by review state, for example. And the other changes were under the hood. A big one was about how we sync and keep these change sets up to date in Sourcegraph. Because as you can imagine, you have to talk to the code host a lot to get the newest data for each pull request, which takes a bunch of requests. And we need to be really smart about when we do this to not overload the code hosts. So that has been improved a lot. And now we're much, much smarter about when we fetch new information. We also incorporate webhooks. So ideally, your code host shouldn't feel us hitting it with requests if the pull requests are not updated every second. If they're updated every second, then we get a webhook every second. So code host is overloading us, I guess.
Yeah. And how does someone get campaigns available on their Sourcegraph instance? How can they use this feature? Right
now, it's behind a feature flag. So if you take a look at the documentation there, it says at the top which feature flag to change. You set that to true, and then in your Sourcegraph instance, you basically can't miss it. At the top right, there's going to be a campaigns icon. And if you click on that, you can create a new campaign, and follow the documentation is the next step, which tells you to download the source CLI, which is what we saw in the video. And with the source CLI, you can create these patch sets and then turn them into campaign. Oh yeah, that's our live.
Yeah.
Our dog food instance.
Yep.
What are some of the other use cases for this aside from like formatting code?
Good question. Can you go to our dog food instance? Maybe we can show a campaign. Yes, so wait a second, video is delayed. Oh yeah, so I think can you click on long-term manual campaign?
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I think, the first big use case, and that is keeping track of a large number of pull requests and their progress. Right now, GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket Server or other code hosts don't offer a view that gives you, an overview of the progress of multiple pull requests. And a lot of our customers are actually interested in having this to see, how changes across a number of repositories are progressing. And with this view, with a so-called manual campaign where you don't create the pull requests on the code host, but you actually add them manually with this form here, you can keep track of how they're progressing. And this is on our dog food instance, I think it only contains pull requests of our own Sourcegraph repository. Can you scroll down, Christina?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it does. And then I also
Yeah.
filtered by open.
Yeah, so I added these to test on our dog food instance, and I would not have expected that there's still open change sets in it by now, because this has now been open since December, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just goes to show
things don't get merged.
Keep track of pull requests. Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
So that is the first big use case, and then can you go back to the overview?
Yeah.
The other big use case is, not just formatting code, but in broad terms, it's whatever you want it to be. That means right now you can execute whatever tool you want over your code base and then turn that into pull requests on GitHub or Bitbucket Server, for example. So if you click on the Go Mod Tidy Sourcegraph campaign, this is, I think Eric created this a couple weeks ago. So this campaign doesn't run Go format, but it runs Go Mod Tidy, which is kind of the same thing. But this is nice to repeatedly run over your repositories. So you can basically say, I have, hey, Sourcegraph, give me all of the repositories that have a Go mod file. And then you just run Go mod tidy and keep running that and keep updating the same campaign. If whenever something changes, you can create a new pull request, Go mod tidy. And in the future, we're gonna build this into campaigns that you can enforce invariants, as we call it. So you can make sure that a campaign always opens a pull request whenever Go mod tidy outputs something other than an empty string, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I think I created the new campaign today. Can you open the Combi campaign that I created this morning? At the bottom.
This one. Yeah.
The rewrite import path, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a second, I'm not seeing the video. Yeah.
So what you can see here is, if you're already seeing my screen, well, Torsten's video catches up, is you can see that you can actually do markdown formatting inside of these descriptions, and that will be translated directly into all of the pull requests that are created on the code hosts. So it's a great way to provide extra context for the people who are going to be receiving these pull requests, so that you know, what is this change and where did it come from, and why is it useful to me?
Yeah, and as you can see here, this is an action definition, the JSON file you're looking at, and it contains two different steps. One is a Docker step, and the other two are command steps. And command means you can execute whatever command the source CLI has access to on your machine. And Docker means you run a Docker container. So in this example, the goal is to run Combi, which allows you to do structural search and replace or structural search, and to rewrite an import path in Go files to a new one. So we're using some Combi magic here to rewrite the import path and catch what's before the thing we want to replace and what's after it, and put it again into a correct import statement. And since this, I ran it this morning and it ran over, I don't know, 30 or 40 repositories. To speed this up, and because I made a mistake when writing the Combi command, I added 2 command steps before and after that moved the vendor directory out of Combi's way. I could have provided Combi with the .go file extension, and then it would not have matched things in the .git directory, which is what's excluded by default. You can see here the exclude dir flag, but since Combi doesn't support multiple exclude dirs yet, Renard said he's going to add this today. I chose to exclude the dot directories and move the vendor directory out of the way. And yeah, this worked really nicely, especially because you can see at the top the scope query, Sourcegraph only returns the search results that actually have the wrong, in quotes, import path. So I don't need to run this over all of the Go repositories that I have, only over the ones that need to be changed. And then, for the ones that have this line, I just run these 3 steps. It produces a patch. And at the bottom, we can see what that looks like. It's just basically rewriting the import path.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we got a question from Ryan about what a manual campaign is and why would we want to use the manual campaign. So we touched on this a little bit and we talked a little bit about manual campaigns, but to reiterate on that, a manual campaign is basically just a collection of existing pull requests. So it allows you to use the Sourcegraph UI to track all of these different pull requests and changes. And as you saw, I can pop back over to the long-term manual campaign. It allows you to actually see the state of these things in a burn up or burn down chart. And so what you do is you add, the path to that repository. So this would be like github.com/sourcegraph, and then the change set or pull request number, and that allows you to add each of these. And so from here, we can make sure that, hey, maybe I've gone and created all of these pull requests manually because it's something that I didn't have before we created campaigns, or you already have existing tooling within your organization. And so you want to leverage and utilize that, and you have this list of campaigns, but you want to make sure, how do I manage them? How do I keep track of them? How do I make sure that they all get closed? And so you can use a manual campaign to track that information. So thank you for your question. Feel free to, if anyone else has other questions, pipe up. Any other questions about campaigns, or should we move on to Kubernetes? All right, Stephen, you want to talk about Kubernetes?
Okay, cool. Sorry, I had to get myself unmuted again. Yeah, so for the Kubernetes deployments, so if you're upgrading from an old version of Sourcegraph to 3.14, there is a step that you'll need to perform, which is a manual migration. So if you go ahead and open up that first link there, Christina, for me. This is essentially what, somebody who's upgrading 3.14 will have to go through. So you'll need to go through here and just read through this. There's a couple of commands here that you can run. And essentially what this is doing is in 3.14, we added support for deploying Sourcegraph in more security constrained and isolated Kubernetes clusters. So what that means is like our Docker containers do not run as root. You can deploy Sourcegraph in a shared Kubernetes cluster under a separate namespace, for example. There's a couple of other things that you can do. You can, by default, Sourcegraph will like monitor the host nodes that are running the containers, and that'll check and verify that we're not running out of CPU or that we're not running out of memory and that sort of thing. And that can basically be monitored through Sourcegraph's built-in monitoring. But in some environments, maybe your company has a team that runs Kubernetes infrastructure, and they've given you, access to a shared Kubernetes cluster. You want to get it deployed into, just a single namespace, and you don't necessarily have permission to, create like a cluster role binding so that you can monitor the Kubernetes host nodes. What you can do now is there's an option to basically say like, I don't necessarily care about monitoring the host node for now, so deploy without that. And so we're able to deploy, in some of the most like security constrained Kubernetes environments. Excuse me. Yeah, we're able to deploy in some of the most security constrained Kubernetes environments that we've seen at some fairly large customers. So.
Cool.
And then
How
some
about
other couple of things here. Yeah, so we've done quite a lot around the observability of Sourcegraph and really improving like both the experience of, when you have a problem with Sourcegraph, we want to get that resolved for you as soon as possible. And so one of the things that my team in particular really focuses on is, making Sourcegraph as debuggable and as easy to monitor and get a sense of like what's going on. And so one of the things that we've done is we've improved some of the debugging that's available in Kubernetes deployments. So what that is essentially is, if you contact support and you say, hey, we're having issues with a search query or something like that, there's some pretty extensive request tracing information that we're able to gather, which will give us information about, request timing and all of the individual operations that happen behind the scenes across, every Sourcegraph service. So as a search query goes through the entire Sourcegraph pipeline to actually get results, we can track that and see where did this actually go wrong so that we can get some more information there. And then the other thing here is some better search insights and alerting around search. So what we had before was essentially some pretty basic bare bones information about search and like maybe how it's interacting with some other services. What we have now is what you see here, which is a lot of information about search at a high level. Are there a lot of errors going on? Are there a lot of is search latency pretty high? Are users seeing a lot of timeouts? So a lot of the things that you really care about just at a high level, if you're relying on Sourcegraph as your code search tool, can be seen through here. And the other useful aspect of this is that this all comes out of the box. So you deploy Sourcegraph, you get a pre-configured Prometheus instance, a pre-configured Grafana instance, and those have alerts defined for you. Those have dashboards defined for you. And so we've really made it easy to go in, set up alerts, have it, send you an email or a Slack message or something, or to PagerDuty or whatever pager system you use, to basically just, send it to that and say, hey, something is wrong with Sourcegraph, and you can go here and you can figure out exactly what it is, and you can get in touch with support, and we can help you figure out what's how to get that fixed. So all of this feeds into that. So there's better insight just all across the board, essentially. So.
Yeah. And Stephen, is this something that everyone who's using Sourcegraph is going to be using, or is this specific to a certain group of, like,
yeah,
if if my company has it, do I need to worry about all of this?
Sure. So if your company is relying on Sourcegraph, setting up alerts is a great idea. That'll tell you whenever something is definitively wrong with Sourcegraph. So if you guys are relying on it, we would encourage every Sourcegraph admin to set up alerts for their Sourcegraph instance. In future versions of Sourcegraph, we're going to have a banner across the top that really directs admins to go and set up alerts and that sort of thing. But yeah, absolutely. Anybody that's relying on Sourcegraph or is maybe having issues with Sourcegraph or feels that it's unstable or anything like that, go in and set up alerts, and we've got documentation for that, which you can find linked on here, I believe. And yeah, so it's a really great way to just feel a little bit more confident about how reliable Sourcegraph is. Have better insight into how the system's behaving when things do start to go wrong or whatever. So yeah.
Awesome. And we had another question from Ryan about what is a customization, but I just want to remind everyone to please use the group chat to ask questions. We've disabled the ability to unmute yourself, so please use the chat, and we're happy to let you even jump on live to ask your questions once you've let us know that you have one.
Sure. So to answer Ryan's question here about what a customization is, so if you actually go back to that Kubernetes upgrade documentation, Christina. So when I was talking before about the different types of ways in which you can deploy Sourcegraph, into a Kubernetes cluster in a separate namespace, or into a Kubernetes cluster with special security requirements and that sort of thing. What those are is essentially those are modifications to the Sourcegraph Kubernetes YAML that we provide to you with each version of Sourcegraph. So essentially, we give you all the Kubernetes YAML, and you run some Kubernetes commands to get those deployed to your cluster. And what Kustomize is this is like the official Kubernetes sanctioned blessed approach, if you will, to making these sort of customizations to some base Kubernetes YAML. So one example here is like, each YAML file that we provide lists out the default namespace as being Sourcegraph. And so if your Kubernetes admins give you, a namespace that's like, our company -Sourcegraph or something, then you would have to go into each one of those files and change that. And more importantly, when you go to upgrade Sourcegraph, you would have to, pull down our changes and deal with those like merge conflicts and stuff. With Kustomize, what you get is it's essentially an overlay. So you've got our YAML, which is the base version, and then you can define your YAML, which basically says, hey, replace this field with this value. And so you only have to write that once. You don't have to deal with any of the merge conflicts and that sort of stuff. And it's just a really kind of nice way of saying like, hey, I've got these options that I want to set in my Kubernetes deployment, and we're gonna set those and override them in the base values and then get that deployed. So yeah, that's what that is. It's similar to other tools like I think Helm is one of them, and there's a couple of others. But this is really the Kubernetes official one. It ships with Kubernetes. It's kind of blessed. So
Thank you. Cool. So, oh, dropping down, we still got your resource estimator, Stephen. I know you're really excited about this one.
Yeah. So, something we've heard a lot in the past is, as soon as somebody's interested in spinning up Sourcegraph, their question is, like, hey, what kind of resources do we need? Do we need a Kubernetes deployment? Do we need a bunch of different servers? What EC2 instance type? How much memory? How many CPUs do we need to give them? All this sort of stuff. And what we've essentially done here is we've turned this into a little web form that you see here. You can, at the very top here, you can enter in the number of repositories that you have, the number of users that you have, if you have any large mono repos. And yeah, and essentially it'll, you punch in your numbers and it'll give you out an estimate that's based off of other known good deployments of Sourcegraph. So, we've seen essentially all of these values, all of these replica counts of individual Sourcegraph services or these deployment types and all this sort of stuff work well at other companies. And so when you punch in these values, essentially it's just giving you an estimate that's based off of all of those. So you can trust that it's a really good, reliable starting point for getting started with your Sourcegraph deployment, essentially. And if you hear those little squeals in the background, those are some cats. So
the siblings are arguing.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So one more thing that we added having to do with forks and archives, not to be confused with excluding forks and archives from your results, but actually excluding forks and archives from even syncing to your Sourcegraph instance. So there's some organizations that use like archiving to really get old cruft out of the way, and there's just really no reason for those repositories to be included in their Sourcegraph instances. People aren't searching for it, and it's just adding to the load and the space and the resources requirements needed by Sourcegraph. And so you just want to exclude those by default. And so we added a configuration, so you can go into your site configuration and update your repository management, and you can just add this little exclude section and either exclude forks or archives or both. So that'll help reduce that load on your Sourcegraph instance. We did get another question from Ryan. For Docker Compose, can you also control the number of replicas for services? If we can unmute Stephen, that would be great.
Perfect. Yeah, so that's a great question. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, where with Docker Compose you can really scale it up to whatever hardware you can throw at it. So it is limited to a single machine, but if you want to go and buy the largest EC2 instance that you want to, then you could scale it up to tens of thousands of repositories and thousands of users, similar to what you would get with like a Kubernetes cluster on multiple machines. When you actually do get to a point where you need multiple replicas of Sourcegraph services, by default, we just recommend that you go with Kubernetes. It's typically a little bit easier to manage, and there are some other nice benefits there, like if a single machine goes down, then all of Sourcegraph doesn't go down. With that being said, we've also seen that a single machine deployment with tens of thousands of repositories and a couple thousand users has been successful with just a really beefy EC2 instance. So you can absolutely do it. When you use the resource estimator, there's also if you go back to that, Christina, what you can do is you can select the deployment type. So if you select estimated, it'll suggest to you what we think is the best. But if you're like, hey, we don't like Kubernetes, or we're not super experienced with it, you can just select Docker Compose and it'll tell you essentially what's needed there, and it will give you those replica counts and stuff. What that means with Docker Compose is you're going to be copying and pasting some sections, and maybe you reach out to us and we give you we can do that for you or help you out there. But yeah, with Kubernetes, you're able to say, give me 3 replicas and it'll do it. With Docker Compose, it's a little bit more manual. So there's some trade-offs there, but you can absolutely do it. This will, give you the answers that you want here. So you can kind of get some ideas from that. And you're always free to reach out too if you have any questions. So.
Awesome. Thank you. So moving right on down the list, back to our blog post here. The next one is around our code intelligence. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the product or familiar with code intelligence, with Sourcegraph, you can get things that you're used to seeing from your IDE, like go to definition and find references on different symbols. And so we provide that just as hover tooltips. And so in this case, you can see an example in this screenshot of Go docs being shown here for the HTTP handler object type, or I guess it's an interface. And in this current release, we're working on improving our precise code intelligence. And so this is using something called Elsif, which stands for Language Server Index Format, which is the solution that we're currently pursuing to provide both fast and precise code intelligence. And so what we've been working on here is improving the Elsif indexer, which basically runs over all of your code and generates a data file that contains all of the connections and references for your code using your runtime information. And so the Go Elsif indexer in this case has been improved to actually include information from imported libraries. So in this case, what you're seeing is documentation around HTTP handler that is not actually part of the repository we're looking at, but is a utility. And we've used, during compile time, we've actually brought in that documentation and used the library to surface that information so you can have greater context just from the information provided by the Elsif indexer on your repository. Additionally, we added thrift to our basic code intelligence. So our basic code intelligence is what you'll see just immediately out of the box when you spin up a Sourcegraph instance. And this is based on search heuristics. And so what you'll find is that it's pretty good. We look at symbols, and we use C tags to make sure that we're providing more accurate results, but it's still based on search. And so that means if you have a function name like find, you're going to notice that it's probably quite overloaded, and you're going to have results that are maybe not quite as precise as you were hoping, because it's going to return results potentially for many, many other function names called find. So if you're looking for something that's more precise, our Elsif solution is a great alternative for you. It just requires that you do a little additional setup and configuration in your CI so that we can pre-compute those precise ASTs. Cool. Oh, thanks for your question, Ryan. How does the Go Elsif index get loaded into Sourcegraph? So that's part of the step that you add to your CI. So it's important that you are able to run the Elsif indexer in a place that has the ability to build your code so that it can actually compile and build the AST. Once you've built that data file, you upload that data file to your Sourcegraph instance. And then Sourcegraph uses that data file to provide the code intelligence as you are perusing your code. Cool. So jumping down to aggregated search data, adding to Sourcegraph pings. So this is one that I'm really excited about personally, is we're really trying to learn how our customers are using their instances. And what we've realized is people that are using sourcegraph.com for open source code search use the Sourcegraph instance in a very different way than people who are using Sourcegraph for looking at code within their organization. The types of searches and the things they care about are just slightly different. And it's been immensely important to us as a team to protect the privacy of our customers and protect that the data that we collect from them is totally anonymous. It's aggregated. And so we're not looking at the searches that you're doing. We're looking at how many times was a specific search filter used. So what that means is we understand that you're really relying heavily on the repo filter, or you're really relying heavily on searching over archives. So using the archived filter all the time. And those are sorts of pieces of information that we can use to improve the product to make it better tuned for the way that people are actually using it inside of those organizations. And we document all of this publicly. You can go and see our philosophy and rules about how we make decisions about adding pings. Like, our intention is not to spy on our users in any way. Our intention is really just to learn about how the product's used in a way that protects that privacy. And thank you to Ryan for adding some additional links for deploying Sourcegraph using Docker Compose to the chat. Stephen also added a link to looking at what is more information about code intelligence, specifically Elsif, if you're curious. Alrighty, jumping down. So this is the last one. This is one that I'm also really excited about. This is still an experimental setting. So if you're using sourcegraph.com, this will have been enabled for you for about a month now. But if you're using Sourcegraph at an organization, this is something that you'll want to go in and turn on as an experimental feature. So the way that you can do that is, oh, let me move everybody's faces out of the way, is you can hop into your personal settings. And inside of settings, you'll go ahead and add the experimental features to turn this feature on. So once you've enabled it, you get within the plain text mode, really nice autocomplete, which helps you find what filters are available to the search. So for example, the repo filter, or repo has commit after, is a really great filter for when you're trying to see, like, hey, this, oh, sorry, repo has commit after, there we go. So what this one does, and we can see this in the hover tooltip, there we go, stream specifying a time frame. And so this lets you filter out stale repositories. So what this helps you do is find repositories that have a commit after some point in time. So if I want to see, show me only repositories that have had a commit within the last year, I'll use this filter to see things that have changed and been updated most recently. You also get these nice autocompletes. And if you type something wrong, for example, you get fun little hovers that let you know, hey, something's wrong, we're not interpreting this as a filter. And so you can see that I, in fact, spelled file wrong, or I typoed. I had my key repeat was too fast. And so now if I want to search instead for maybe all Go files, I can do that. Oh, and I get that wrong every single time. And so that'll return all files ending in Go. Maybe I'm interested in something having to do with auth. I don't care about authors in this case. And so I can perform those searches. So this is a, like I said, experimental feature. We're hoping to get it into the 3.15 release. So that means it's especially important for us to be getting feedback from our users. So if you have any feedback in using it, or you notice any bugs or things that aren't quite right, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you on that. Alrighty, so that's all of the major things that we wanted to talk about from the release today. And I'd love to pause and just see if anyone has any other questions. I hope, like, thank you to Ryan for asking questions along the way. I also have a few questions that had come in ahead of time with email. So let's see here. Let me look through my list of questions. So the first question is, what's the relationship between code hosts and the code intelligence that Sourcegraph provides? So Sourcegraph provides code intelligence, which is what we saw with the hovers. We can go back and look at Sourcegraph here and see that in action. Torsten wants to know how many cats Stephen has. And I believe the answer is 9. So what we're seeing here is that hover. And so what you can see is the definition. This lets us know what the function definition looks like, what parameters this function call actually takes, with a little bit of information about the documentation around it. And so what we can do is actually pop over into GitHub and look at this file inside of GitHub. Shoot, I didn't look at what line number I was on, so I'm going to be using probably a different example here. But you get those same hovers and information inside of your code host. You'll notice that Find References has a little icon indicating that it's an external link. The reason for that is because GitHub does not have a code view for looking at references, but we can go to the definition directly from inside of GitHub. And so what you see here is it actually takes me to a new file and jumps me directly to the implementation of that function. Whereas if I want to go and see the references, I'm going to end up back in Sourcegraph, where I can see the history of this file. Why am I seeing the history? There it goes. Oh, it's just taking a second. So you can see the history of the file. You can see the GitHub changes over time. So the different pull requests that have been merged for this. You can take a look at the different implementations. And then what we were originally coming here to look at was references. And so in this case, it's having a little trouble finding those references. So that's unfortunately a poor example. But we can again see that the definition here. I guess, does that answer your question, Ryan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Cool.
I think something else worth calling out there is you also get this as part of, like, when you're viewing the diff on a pull request.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that could be kind of useful to show as well.
Sure. So if we pop back over to GitHub and take a look at Sourcegraph and look at some of our open pull requests. Let's see what looks good here. Should go look at Torsten's change.
Yeah.
His draft change. And it looks like he's adding some tests here. And so where this is helpful is you can actually, while you're doing a pull request, while you're doing your code review of a pull request, get that information. So maybe you weren't familiar with the run workers method or function call, and so you want a little more information about that. So I can go ahead and click on that. And it looks like this is actually defined inside of this. It's defined inside of the pull request. And so it keeps me in this context and jumps me down and says, hey, actually, you can get that information right here. Here's the information that you were looking for.
One reason I find that pretty useful is because like throughout my day, people are, like, hey, can you review this? And it's like code that I've never modified or touched or looked at before. And at the same time, I'm like working on something else in my editor. And so to not lose that context in my editor and in my terminal and stuff, and to be able to have like that same, jump to definition, hover, like the same stuff that I would get in my editor, right there is useful for me. And I think one other thing worth calling out here too is that you can get this on GitHub. You get the same exact thing on GitLab and on Bitbucket and Fabricator, and I think there's another one that I'm forgetting. So it's pretty useful that you can get that in any of these places, I think. And to answer Ryan's question here about how you would actually get this, so if you're using Sourcegraph if you're using GitHub on like public code, like our repository here is public, you can actually just install the Sourcegraph browser extension, and you'll have that, and it'll just work, and it'll be using sourcegraph.com. If you're using if you've got private repositories or something, then what you would want to do is you would want to set up a Sourcegraph instance that has those repositories on it. And then similarly, you would use the same exact browser extension. You would just change that URL that Christina had back open there. And yeah, essentially you just set this to your Sourcegraph instance with your private repositories on it. And that keeps everything, 100% like yours locked down, behind your corporate firewall or VPN or whatever. And that's one of the cool aspects, I think, of Sourcegraph is that you have it completely on premise. It's not, we're never like, sending your private code up to sourcegraph.com or anything like that. It's completely locked down. You can firewall off the entire thing if you want. And so it's, we're really selling software, not user data.
Absolutely. Cool. And then one thing Torsten noted was when I did this go to definition, it noticed that this is the old definition, whereas down here on line 61, we have the new definition. And come on, Betty. It actually, in both cases, took me to the correct line. So in the new definition, it took me to line 32. And the first time I ran this, it took me to line 33, accurately jumping me to the old definition. So that's just a nice property. Alrighty, well, we are at time. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It was great to have you on. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us on Twitter, via email. We're totally available and we love to hear from you. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.